If the Bible has already told the full story, then why does it still feel incomplete? It's a quiet question, almost easy to ignore at first, but the longer you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because in one of the most mysterious passages ever written, Genesis chapter 6, we are given just enough information to provoke curiosity, but not enough to satisfy it. We are told about the Nephilim, beings of immense power who once walked the earth. We are told about the Watchers, who are punished for what they did. And yet, in the middle of it all, there is a silence that feels deliberate. The Nephilim disappear, the Watchers are judged, but the women, the ones who gave birth to them, are never truly mentioned again. And that silence feels heavier than any explanation. If you're drawn to mysteries like this, stories that sit between history, theology, and something far more unsettling, consider subscribing and following the channel AVF, because some stories are not meant to be fully answered, only explored. The tension in this narrative does not come from what is said, but from what is left unsaid. There is something deeply unsettling about a sacred text choosing not to explain a crucial part of its own story. It suggests that either the answer was too complex, too controversial, or perhaps too disturbing to be stated directly. And so, for thousands of years, that silence has remained, inviting speculation, interpretation, and unease. To understand where this mystery begins, we have to return to Genesis 6, a passage so KTSR, yet so dense that it has shaped entire theological debates across generations. It tells us that as humanity multiplied on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. From this union came the Nephilim, described as mighty men of old, men of renown, and that is all. No detailed explanation, no clear definition, no elaboration on what these beings truly were. Who exactly were the sons of God? This question alone has divided scholars and theologians for centuries. Some interpret them as fallen angels, divine beings who abandoned their place and crossed into the human realm. Others argue they were simply the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, who intermingled with the descendants of Cain, the corrupt line. Two interpretations, both attempting to resolve the same ambiguity. Yet regardless of which interpretation one accepts, the core issue remains unchanged. A boundary was crossed. Something that was not meant to happen, happened. And then there are the Nephilim. Often translated as giants, the term itself carries deeper implications. Its root can also suggest the fallen ones, or even those who cause others to fall. This shifts the understanding entirely. These were not just physically imposing beings, they represented a distortion, a deviation from the natural order, something that should not have existed within the framework of creation. And still, the text offers no further clarification. There is no description of their lives, no explanation of their role, no insight into their behavior or their influence on the world. The narrative moves forward almost abruptly, shifting its focus to the growing facade of humanity and the eventual decision to bring about the flood. It is as if the presence of the Nephilim is acknowledged, but intentionally left unexplored. And then we return again to the same haunting question. What about the women? They are central to the event. They are the ones who bore these beings, yet their fate is never described. Were they victims? Were they willing participants? Did they perish in the flood like the rest of humanity, or was their fate something else entirely? The absence of answers creates a different kind of narrative tension, because when a text that is otherwise explicit about sin and consequence chooses to remain silent, it forces the reader into an uncomfortable position. You are no longer just receiving a story, you are being invited to confront the unknown. This is what makes Genesis 6 so enduringly mysterious. It does not resolve its own questions. Instead, it leaves behind what can only be described as an intentional gap, a space where interpretation begins, where external texts attempt to fill in what was omitted, and where imagination and theology collide. Some later writings, like the Book of Enoch, attempt to expand on this narrative, offering detailed accounts of the Watchers, their descent, and their actions. But even these accounts, vivid as they are, do not fully erase the weight of the original silence, because the silence itself may be the point. It suggests that not everything is meant to be fully understood, that some events exist not as complete explanations, but as fragments, pieces of a larger reality that remains just out of reach. And in that sense, the story of Genesis 6 becomes more than a historical or theological account. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of humanity's own limits. We want clarity, we want definitions, we want to categorize and explain. But here, we are confronted with something that resists all of that. A story that begins with a simple union and ends with a global catastrophe, yet leaves its most human element unresolved. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful, because in that unresolved space, we are forced to ask not just what happened back then, but what it means now. What it says about boundaries, about desire, about the consequences of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. Genesis 6 does not give us closure. It gives us a question. And sometimes, a question can echo longer than any answer ever could. The silence of Genesis does not end the story, it creates a vacuum. And throughout history, whenever a vacuum appears, something eventually moves in to fill it. In this case, that something is an ancient text known as the Book of Enoch, a work that was never fully accepted into the biblical canon, yet refused to disappear. It lingers at the edges of theology, like a forgotten fragment that somehow remembers more than it should. According to this text, the sons of God mentioned in Genesis are not symbolic, nor are they merely human. They are identified as the Watchers, beings assigned a specific role within the divine order. They were not rebels from the beginning. They were guardians, observers. Their purpose was not to interfere, but to watch humanity from a distance, to witness its development without altering its course. And that is what makes what happens next so unsettling. Because the Watchers did not fall by accident. They chose to descend. The Book of Enoch describes a moment not of weakness, but of decision. 200 of these beings gathered together, not in chaos, but in deliberate unity. The location is specific, Mount Hermon, a place that, in ancient tradition, was often seen as a boundary between heaven and earth. It is here that the line is crossed, but not impulsively. They make a pact. This detail changes everything. One of them, often identified as their leader, understands the risk. If a single Watcher were to act alone, the punishment would fall entirely on him. But if all of them act together, the burden is shared, responsibility is diluted, and so, one by one, they swear an oath, not of loyalty, but of rebellion. This is not a moment of temptation, it is strategy. Each of them commits to the same course of action. They will descend to the earth, they will take human women, and they will step beyond the limits that were set for them. What we are witnessing here is not a spontaneous fall from grace. It is a coordinated breach of order. And that distinction matters, because it reframes the entire narrative. This is no longer about individual failure, it is about collective intent. A group decision, calculated and reinforced by mutual agreement. An organized movement rather than a personal collapse. And once that movement begins, it does not remain contained. The Watchers do not arrive empty-handed. If their descent had been driven only by desire, the consequences might have been limited. It would have been a moral failure, perhaps even a tragic one, but still contained within the boundaries of individual action. But the Book of Enoch introduces a far more complex and disturbing dimension. They bring knowledge, not ordinary knowledge, but what the text repeatedly suggests are forbidden teachings, insights that were not meant for humanity at that stage of its existence. These were not small lessons. They were transformative tools, capable of reshaping the structure of society itself. They taught humans how to forge weapons, swords, shields, armor, techniques that turn survival into domination. They revealed the secrets of working with metals, extracting and shaping elements hidden beneath the earth. They introduced astrology, the reading of the heavens, offering a sense of control over time and fate. And perhaps most controversially, they taught forms of enchantment, what later traditions would call magic. This was not random sharing, it was distribution. And the way this knowledge was distributed reveals something even more calculated. According to the text, men and women did not receive the same teachings. Men were given tools of external power, violence, warfare, control through force. Women, on the other hand, were taught something far more subtle. They were taught influence, the use of adornment, cosmetics and beauty not merely as expression, but as leverage. They were taught about herbs, mixtures, and methods that could alter perception, emotion, even intention. This was not power that operates in the open. It was power that works from within, quiet, persuasive, and difficult to resist. And when you step back and look at this structure, a pattern begins to emerge. This is not chaos, it is a system in which different forms of power are assigned to different groups, each reinforcing the other. Physical dominance on one side, psychological and emotional influence on the other. Together, they create a framework that can reshape human behavior from multiple angles. This is where the narrative shifts from myth into something that feels uncomfortably strategic. Because what is being described is not simply corruption, it is infiltration. Not an invasion through force, at least not at first, but an invasion through knowledge. Through the gradual introduction of tools that alter how people think, how they relate to one another, and how they understand their place in the world. It does not begin with destruction, it begins with transformation, and transformation, when it is subtle enough, can go unnoticed until it is too late. This raises a question that is far more difficult than anything posed earlier in Genesis. If humanity received these things willingly, if they accepted the knowledge, embraced the power, and integrated it into their lives, then where does responsibility lie? It is easy to frame the Watchers as the source of corruption. But the narrative, especially as expanded in Enoch, suggests something more complicated. The exchange was not entirely one-sided. The Watchers brought knowledge, yes, but humans accepted it. They used it. They built with it. And in doing so, they became part of the process. This is what makes the story so difficult to categorize. It resists simple labels like victim and aggressor. Instead, it presents a scenario in which both sides are driven by desire. The Watchers seek experience, physical existence, emotion, connection. Humanity seeks elevation, power, understanding, the ability to transcend its limitations. And when those desires intersect, the result is not balance, it is escalation. What begins as an exchange becomes a dependency. What feels like progress becomes distortion. And because the change happens gradually, it does not immediately appear as a threat. It appears as advancement, as improvement, as something beneficial. That is the most dangerous part, because by the time the consequences become visible, the system is already in place. And at that point, it is no longer just about what the Watchers did. It is about what humanity became once it accepted what was offered. The story, at this stage, is no longer confined to ancient texts or distant events. It begins to take on a pattern, a model that can be recognized beyond its original context. A model where knowledge is not neutral, where power reshapes those who receive it, and where the line between growth and corruption becomes increasingly difficult to see. And just like in the beginning, it does not start with destruction. It starts with a choice. By the time the system is in place, by the time knowledge has been distributed, power has taken root, and human behavior has begun to shift, the story reaches a point where it can no longer be understood in simple terms. What once appeared to be a narrative of invasion now becomes something far more complex, because at the center of it all stands a question that refuses to go away. Were the women merely victims, or were they participants? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Beings of higher power descend, take human women, and produce offspring. It is easy, almost instinctive, to interpret this as domination, as an act imposed by force. But as the narrative expands, especially through the lens of Enoch, that clarity begins to dissolve. Something else is happening beneath the surface. The relationship described is not entirely one-sided. The Watchers do not only take, they also give. And what they offer is not insignificant. Knowledge, influence, access to something beyond ordinary human experience. These are not trivial gifts, they are transformative. And that changes the dynamic. Because once something is offered and received, the interaction is no longer purely coercive. It becomes reciprocal. Not equal, but reciprocal. The women are no longer positioned only as those who are acted upon. They are also those who respond, who accept, who engage. This is the turning point in the interpretation. It introduces discomfort because it removes the simplicity of moral categories. It is easier to understand a story where one side is entirely guilty and the other entirely innocent. But this narrative resists that simplicity. It suggests that the line between victim and participant is not always clear, especially when power is involved. The Watchers sought something they did not have: physical existence, sensation, embodiment. Humanity, on the other hand, was drawn towards something it had never possessed: elevated knowledge, expanded capability, influence beyond natural limits. Each side desired what the other represented, and in that intersection of desire, a form of exchange emerges. Not written, not formalized, but real. A transaction. Humanity receives power, tools that allow it to shape, control, and influence its environment in ways previously impossible. The Watchers receive experience, entry into the material world, into the immediacy of human life. Neither side walks away unchanged. Neither side remains what it once was. And that is where the consequences begin. Because once a boundary is crossed through mutual participation, it becomes far more difficult to reverse. There is no clear point of return, no single moment that can be isolated and undone. Instead, the change spreads, quietly at first, then more visibly. And from that exchange, something new is born. The Nephilim. They are not presented as ordinary offspring. Even in the brief mention within Genesis, they are described as mighty men, figures of renown. But when viewed through the expanded narrative, their existence takes on a far more unsettling dimension. They are the product of incompatibility, not just biologically, but structurally, a merging of two orders that were never meant to intersect. And because of that, they do not develop within the limits that govern either world. Their growth is abnormal, rapid, disproportionate. They do not follow the rhythms of human life, they accelerate beyond them. What might initially appear as strength quickly reveals itself as instability, because their needs do not match their environment. They consume more, they demand more. The systems that sustain ordinary human life cannot support them. And so the imbalance begins. At first it may go unnoticed, a strain on resources, a subtle shift in distribution. But imbalance, once introduced, rarely remains contained. It expands. The Nephilim begin by consuming what is available: food, land, animals. But as their numbers and appetites grow, the existing world cannot keep up. Scarcity emerges, and when scarcity appears, behavior changes. Consumption becomes aggression. The narrative, particularly in Enoch, does not shy away from this escalation. It suggests that the Nephilim, unable to sustain themselves within the limits of the natural world, turn toward increasingly destructive means, They devour animals. Then, eventually, they turn toward humanity itself. This is the point where the story shifts from abnormality to catastrophe, because what was once seen as a sign of greatness, strength, size, power, reveals itself as something else entirely. Not superiority, but excess. Not advancement, but instability. A system pushed beyond its capacity to sustain itself. And in that collapse, a deeper realization begins to take shape. This is not evolution. It is corruption. The difference is critical. Evolution implies adaptation, integration, a gradual alignment with the environment. Corruption, on the other hand, implies distortion, a deviation that disrupts balance rather than achieving it. The Nephilim do not harmonize with the world. They overwhelm it. They are not the next step. They are a break in the sequence. And that break does not remain isolated. It affects everything around it. Social structures begin to fracture. Fear replaces stability. Trust erodes. The very fabric of human life, community, family, continuity, begins to unravel under the pressure of something it cannot accommodate. What makes this stage of the story particularly disturbing is not just the scale of destruction, but its origin. It began with something that did not look like destruction. It began with curiosity, with desire, with the possibility of becoming more than what one already was. There were no immediate signs of catastrophe, no clear warning that the path being taken would lead to collapse. On the contrary, it may have felt like progress, like advancement, like a step forward. And that is what makes the outcome so difficult to confront, because it suggests that not all paths that appear to lead upward actually do. Some lead outward, away from balance, away from sustainability, away from the very structure that allows life to continue. And once that movement begins, it does not require malicious intent to continue. It sustains itself through momentum. The Nephilim, in this sense, are more than characters within a story. They are a manifestation, a visible expression of what happens when incompatible elements are forced together in pursuit of something greater. They represent the cost of crossing boundaries without fully understanding why those boundaries existed in the first place. And as the world within the narrative begins to fracture under their presence, the question that emerges is no longer about how it started. It becomes about whether it can be stopped, because by this point the system is no longer under control, not of the Watchers, not of humanity, and certainly not of the beings that have been created. What began as a choice has become a condition, and conditions, once fully formed, rarely resolve themselves. They require intervention, something external, something capable of addressing not just the symptoms but the structure itself. And that realization brings the story closer to a turning point, one that will not restore what was lost, but will attempt to erase what cannot be sustained. A reset, not because it is desired, but because nothing else remains possible. By the time the Nephilim have fully emerged as a force within the world, the consequences are no longer isolated. What began as a deviation, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, has now spread into every layer of existence. The imbalance is no longer theoretical. It is visible, tangible, and impossible to ignore. Society begins to fracture. Structures that once held communities together, order, trust, shared norms, start to erode under the weight of something they were never designed to withstand. Power, once introduced in uneven and unnatural ways, does not remain neutral. It amplifies itself. Those who possess it reshape their surroundings, often without restraint, often without foresight. Control is lost, not in a single moment, but gradually, like a system failing piece by piece. Authority weakens, stability dissolves. What replaces it is not a new order, but a vacuum filled with tension and unpredictability. Fear becomes the dominant force, not just fear of the unknown, but fear of what has already become known. Because by now, the presence of the Nephilim is no longer distant or abstract. It is immediate. People do not just hear about them, they encounter them. They see the scale of their strength, the intensity of their patrebnesty, the absence of limits in their behavior. And with that realization comes something deeper than fear. It becomes awareness, an understanding that what has been introduced into the world cannot be contained within it. And when a system recognizes that it cannot contain what exists within it, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes a trajectory. This collapse does not remain confined to public structures. It penetrates the most intimate layer of human life, the family. If society is the outer framework, the family is its core. It is where trust is formed, where identity is shaped, where continuity is maintained across generations. But when the foundational balance of the world is disrupted, even this core cannot remain intact. The narrative reaches its most disturbing point here. Because the breakdown is no longer structural, it is relational. The bond between parent and child, one of the most fundamental connections in human existence, begins to unravel. The Nephilim, driven by needs that exceed the limits of their environment, turn not just outward but inward. The line between protector and threat disappears. The story suggests something almost unthinkable: children turning against those who gave them life. This is not just violence, it is inversion, a complete reversal of the natural order. The place where care once existed becomes a site of Hof. The relationship that once ensured survival becomes a channel of destruction. And in that reversal, the full weight of the catastrophe is revealed. This is the extreme, not because of the scale alone, but because of what it represents. When the most basic human bond collapses, there is nothing left to stabilize the system. No remaining structure strong enough to absorb the damage. No remaining relationship capable of restoring trust. At this point, the narrative crosses a threshold. It is no longer about corruption spreading. It is about a world that has already been transformed beyond recovery. And when a system reaches that level of breakdown, the question is no longer how to repair it. It becomes whether it can be repaired at all. The answer, within the framework of the story, is clear. It cannot. And so, the idea of intervention emerges, not as a preference, but as a necessity, not as an act of escalation, but as the only remaining response to a system that has exceeded its limits. This is where the flood enters the narrative. Often understood as a moment of divine judgment, it can also be seen as something more structural, a reset. Not merely the removal of corruption, but the clearing of a system that can no longer sustain itself. The waters rise not just to punish, but to erase, to remove every layer that has been distorted beyond recognition. It is total. There is no partial correction here, no selective adjustment. The scale of the intervention matches the scale of the collapse. Everything that has been affected is swept away. Every trace of the imbalance is targeted for removal. The Nephilim, for all their strength, do not survive this. Their size, their power, their tfaut, none of it protects them. In the face of something that operates on a different level entirely, their existence proves temporary. What once seemed dominant is revealed as fragile. What once appeared unstoppable is brought to an abrupt end. They disappear, as if they had never existed at all. The Watchers, however, meet a different fate. They are not destroyed in the same way. Instead, according to the extended tradition, they are restrained, confined, removed from the system they disrupted, but not erased from existence. This distinction is important. It suggests that the source of the disruption is not simply eliminated, but contained, held in suspension, waiting. And for a moment, it seems as though the narrative has reached its conclusion. The cause has been addressed. The effect has been removed. The system has been cleared. A new beginning appears possible. But then, the silence returns. Because even after the flood, even after the reset, one question remains unresolved. It lingers in the same way it did at the beginning. untouched by the explanations that attempt to surround it. Where are the women? They were central to everything that happened. They stood at the intersection of the exchange. They carried the consequences within their own bodies. They lived through the transformation, witnessed the collapse, and existed at the center of the catastrophe. And yet, when the waters recede, they are not mentioned. Did they perish along with the rest of humanity? That would be the simplest answer, the most straightforward conclusion. But the narrative, as it has unfolded so far, does not favor simplicity. It leaves patterns, gaps, unresolved threads that resist closure, and this is one of them. Because if their story ended with the flood, it would have been stated. Just as the fate of the Nephilim is implied, just as the punishment of the Watchers is described. The absence of such a statement suggests something else. Not certainty, but possibility. The possibility that their story does not end here. That the flood, while it resets the visible world, does not necessarily resolve everything beneath the surface. That some consequences do not disappear, they transform. And if that is true, then the flood is not a conclusion, it is a transition, a boundary between what was seen and what might continue in another form. Which means the story, despite everything that has happened, is not over. It has only changed shape. And the question that opened this narrative still stands, waiting, unresolved, and perhaps more unsettling now than it was at the beginning. Because sometimes what survives is not what we expect, but what was never fully explained in the first place. If the flood did not fully resolve the story, then what followed is not a continuation in the traditional sense, it is a transformation. The narrative no longer unfolds in clear events or visible actions. Instead, it shifts into something less concrete, more elusive. The focus moves away from what can be seen, toward what might persist beneath the surface. This is where one of the most controversial interpretations begins to take shape. What if the women did not simply die? What if instead they changed? Not in the way that living beings change over time, but in a more fundamental sense, crossing from one form of existence into another. The idea is not presented as a certainty, but as a possibility drawn from fragments, patterns, and recurring motifs across different traditions. It is not stated directly in the canonical texts, but it emerges in the spaces between them. A different kind of survival, not physical, not human, but not entirely gone. According to some interpretations derived from ancient writings and later mythologies, the fate of these women was not destruction, but transformation. A transition into a state that no longer belongs fully to the human world. A condition shaped not by what they were originally, but by what they became through their involvement in the exchange. And if that is true, then their story did not end with the flood, it evolved. This is where the narrative begins to intersect with familiar figures, entities that appear across cultures, separated by geography and time, yet sharing strikingly similar characteristics. Among them are the sirens of ancient Greek tradition. Often imagined today as beautiful beings of the sea, their original depiction was far more unsettling. They did not exist to love, they existed to lure. Their voices were not merely songs, they were instruments, designed to reach into the deepest desires of those who heard them, to draw them closer, to override reason with longing. And once that pull was successful, there was no return. What began as attraction ended in destruction. A similar pattern appears in the figure of Lilith, a presence rooted in ancient Near Eastern traditions, associated with the night, with independence, with a form of power that exists outside of accepted order. She is often portrayed not simply as dangerous, but as autonomous, unbound, operating beyond the structures that define human roles. And then there are the succubi of medieval European lore, entities said to approach humans in their most vulnerable states, through dreams, through the subconscious, using allure not as an expression, but as a mechanism, a way to influence, to drain, to alter. different names, different contexts, but the same pattern, a form that combines attraction with danger, beauty with consequence, influence that operates not through force, but through proximity, through access to the human mind, to desire, to vulnerability. These are not creatures of open conflict. They do not dominate through strength. They operate through connection. And that is precisely what makes them difficult to resist. If these figures are viewed not as isolated myths, but as fragments of a larger pattern, a possibility begins to emerge. That what is being described across these traditions is not coincidence, but memory, distorted, reinterpreted, but rooted in a shared origin, a trace of something older. And within that possibility lies a deeper implication, that the transformation of the women was not a punishment in the conventional sense, not simply removal, not annihilation, but continuation under altered conditions, a state where the very qualities they once engaged with, attraction, influence, the ability to affect others, are not taken away, but intensified, extended beyond control. This is where the idea becomes particularly unsettling, because it suggests a form of consequence that does not remove the original desire, but locks it into permanence. A condition where what was once chosen becomes what cannot be escaped. Not loss, but fixation. And in that fixation, a pattern forms. These entities, whether understood literally or symbolically, represent something that exists at the edge of human experience. They are not entirely external. They interact with the internal, with thought, with emotion, with longing. They reveal how influence can operate without visibility, how control can exist without force, which brings the narrative to its deepest level. Because at this point, the story is no longer about ancient beings or distant events. It becomes about something much closer: human nature. When stripped of its mythological framework, the structure of the story reveals a consistent pattern. The initial act was not driven purely by external pressure. It was made possible by an internal condition, a desire to go beyond what was given, to access more, to become more, to reach into something that existed just beyond the boundary. And that desire did not begin with action. It began with intention. This is the core of the narrative. The problem was never just what was done, it was what was wanted. Because desire, once it exceeds its natural limits, begins to reshape perception. It redefines what is acceptable. It reframes risk as opportunity. It makes the unknown appear desirable rather than dangerous. And once that shift occurs, action follows naturally. This is why the story does not feel distant, because the pattern repeats, not in the same form, not with the same characters, but with the same structure. Humanity continues to pursue knowledge beyond its current understanding, continues to seek power beyond its current capacity, continues to look for ways to accelerate progress, to bypass limits, to reach outcomes faster, to become more. And on the surface, this drive appears positive. It fuels innovation, discovery, advancement. But the narrative introduces a necessary tension. It asks whether every form of more leads in the same direction, whether the pursuit itself is neutral or whether it carries its own trajectory. Because not all growth is aligned. Some forms of expansion move outward, away from balance, away from integration. And when that happens, the consequences do not always appear immediately. They unfold over time, embedded within the very systems that were created to improve life. This is the repetition, not of events, but of structure. A desire emerges, an opportunity appears, a boundary is crossed, and only later does the cost become visible. The story, in this sense, is not a warning about a specific moment in the past. It is a model, a reflection of how easily the pursuit of power and knowledge can shift from exploration into distortion. How something that begins as curiosity can become something that reshapes identity itself. And at the center of that model is a single, persistent truth. The most significant changes do not begin with actions. They begin with what we are willing to desire. And once that desire takes hold, everything that follows becomes easier to justify, even when the outcome is something we never intended to create. By the time the story reaches this point, after the silence, the descent, the exchange, the corruption, the collapse, and the flood, it becomes clear that it is no longer confined to the past. What once appeared to be a distant narrative, rooted in ancient texts and mythological figures, begins to mirror something far more immediate. Because the pattern has not disappeared, it has adapted. The figures may have changed, the language may be different, but the structure remains intact. And if we look closely enough, the role once attributed to the Watchers does not feel entirely unfamiliar. Not as literal beings descending from the sky, but as forces that introduce knowledge, power, and possibility into human life faster than it can be fully understood. Today, the Watcher is no longer a figure standing at the boundary between heaven and earth. It is embedded within the systems we interact with every day. Technology, instant access to information, the ability to influence, to shape perception, to reach others across vast distances in moments. These are not inherently negative. In many ways, they represent the height of human progress, tools that expand capability, increase efficiency, and connect the world in unprecedented ways. But the question is not whether these tools are useful. The question is how they are used and what they invite, because alongside their benefits, they carry something else, something more subtle, a form of temptation that does not present itself as danger, but as opportunity, the promise of faster results, easier access, greater control, a shorter path. And that is where the parallel becomes difficult to ignore. The Watchers, in the ancient narrative, did not force humanity into submission. They offered something appealing, something that seemed to elevate those who received it. And in accepting that offer, humanity stepped into a process it did not fully understand. The same dynamic exists today. The desire to bypass effort, to accelerate growth, to gain influence without the time it would normally require, to understand more, control more, achieve more, often without fully considering the long-term consequences. These are not extreme desires, they are ordinary, and that is precisely why they are powerful. Because they do not appear as threats, they appear as improvements, as advancements, as logical next steps in a world that values speed, efficiency, and expansion. But embedded within them is a familiar structure, a quiet invitation to move beyond natural limits, to exceed, to override, to take what is available without always questioning whether it should be. This is the modern form of temptation, not dramatic, not obvious, but integrated into daily life. It does not demand attention, it assumes it. It becomes part of the environment, shaping behavior not through force, but through repetition. And once again, the boundary is not crossed in a single moment. It is crossed gradually, through choices that seem small, reasonable, even necessary, until the accumulation of those choices begins to alter something deeper: how we think, how we relate, how we define ourselves. This is where the theological dimension of the story becomes essential. Because at its core, the narrative is not simply about power or knowledge. It is about discernment, about the ability to recognize that not everything that appears as light truly comes from a good source. This principle is both simple and difficult. Simple in its statement: not every form of illumination is truth. Not every advancement leads to alignment. Not every opportunity is meant to be taken. But difficult in its application, because false light rarely presents itself as false. It mimics what is good. It reflects what is desirable. It offers clarity, capability, even a sense of purpose. And yet, over time, it leads away from balance, away from humility, away from the structure that sustains human life in a meaningful way. This is the warning embedded within the narrative. The cost of crossing certain boundaries is not always immediate loss. It is transformation, a gradual shift into something that no longer operates within the original framework, a condition where control is not lost all at once, but redistributed until the individual no longer fully governs their own direction. The tools they use begin to shape them in return. They become what they engage with. And this is where the story reaches its most personal point, because it is no longer about ancient figures or distant consequences. It is about the present moment, about the choices that are made not in dramatic situations, but in ordinary ones. The decisions that seem small but carry direction. The moments where something is offered, knowledge, power, influence, and must be either accepted or declined. This is the modern Mount Hermon, not a physical location, but a condition, a point where a decision is made, where an invitation is recognized or ignored, where a line is either respected or crossed. And like in the original narrative, the choice is rarely framed as dangerous. It is framed as beneficial, as necessary, as progress. Which leads to the final question. Are you standing at that boundary now? Not in a symbolic sense, but in a practical one. Facing something that promises more control, more understanding, more capability. Something that appears justified, even advantageous, but carries with it an uncertainty that is easy to dismiss. Can you recognize it? Can you see the difference between what aligns and what simply appeals? Because the most significant decisions are not always the most visible ones. They are often the quietest, the ones that occur internally before any action is taken, the ones that determine not just what you will do, but what you are willing to become. And that is where the entire narrative converges, not in the events themselves, but in the pattern they reveal. The original error was not the act, it was the desire that made the act possible, the willingness to reach beyond what was given without fully understanding why the boundary existed. The belief that gaining more would not fundamentally change the one who gains it. But it does. It always does. And so the story does not end with a conclusion. It ends with a question, one that does not demand an answer immediately, but lingers, waiting to be confronted in the moments that matter most. What are you willing to desire? Because whatever that answer is, everything else will follow.